Starting on page 456, we read a little bit about the importance of feedback from hearers. In this section, a couple of experimental situations are described, and they sort of revolve around this situation in which a murder is described. So the original version of the murder scene can be read at the top of page 457. It's about a robber who's hiding and comes out and stabs an individual. Now, the weapon that's used in the first scenario is a knife, but later experimenters use different kinds of weapons. They experimentally manipulated and said sometimes that it was, for instance, an ice pick. In the original experiments that were done to analyze whether people were interested in the feedback of their listeners or not, instead, the original study was interested in knowing whether people were good at mind reading, whether they could put themselves in the shoes of somebody else. And in this study, it's described on page 457 and 458, the hearers were just as likely to mention the unusual instrument, an ice pick, if their confederates were looking at a picture of the scene with an ice pick in the picture, as if they weren't looking at a picture with an ice pick, right? So it seemed like it didn't really matter if the fact that it was an ice pick was already an easily ascertained cue from the picture or not. Research participants were just as likely to share that piece of information, that detail. So they weren't putting themselves into the perspective of their hearers. If they had been, we would have expected them to mention the ice pick much more often if there wasn't a picture of an ice pick, because that's an important detail. However, a second follow-up study was done with the same experimental protocol that found the opposite results. They found, in fact, that when there was a picture of an ice pick, that people were much less likely to mention the ice pick than if there was no picture available for the hearer. If the hearer was not looking at a picture, then the research participants were very likely to mention the ice pick. Now, the author of our text says, why the difference between these two studies? They're the exact same protocol, except the fact that in the latter study, real research participants were recruited to be both the speakers and the hearers. In the former study, Confederates had served as the hearers across lots of different participants. And these Confederates sat there as passive listeners, not essentially. They had already heard this story of the murder dozens of times over, as participant after participant after participant came in and shared this same piece of little snippet of crime scene. In the latter study, these participants who were the hearers were actually new participants. They had never heard this story before. And so they were giving back-channel responses, or in other words, cues that would indicate to the speaker whether they were understanding and how well. Some examples of these kinds of cues are given in the text: a furrowed brow, a quizzical look, a slight impatience to get on with the story or stop being around the bush. They might say okay or make head nods or approving little sounds. Things like that will indicate to the speaker information that they need to know it'll indicate to the speaker that they understand or don't understand what's being said. And so by giving these back-channel responses, it significantly shifted how the participants were telling the story of the murder. We find in Language at Large 11.3, this box here, a similar phenomenon going on with professors. If we apply this material to the classroom, we can see that really it's not oftentimes professors' faults if they have a difficult time communicating some material about the course. For instance, I mentioned on an earlier recording for this chapter that it's a struggle for both me and for you in an online environment. It's a struggle for you to understand because you don't have the opportunity to ask questions or follow up or stop me if I say something that's unclear and ask for clarification. And I also struggle because of those same things. I don't have the opportunity to look at your faces and to see if you're understanding or not. And even in the traditional classroom, when we're as we say in seat, we sometimes as students adopt the practice of blanking our faces and not making any kind of response if we're not understanding, because we don't want other students to think we're stupid. Or sometimes we are terribly bored of the lecture and we don't want the professor to really catch on to that, so we pretend to be interested. Or sometimes we sit in the back so that we won't so that we can avoid eye contact. Sometimes we look down and take notes if we are getting a little bit lost, so that we can avoid the awkwardness of confronting with eye gaze a really awkward or a poor professor. So all these things that are cues from the students can misrepresent to the professor whether the students are understanding or not. Anyway, so, I guess it's a difficult situation all around. It's difficult for professors, it's difficult for students, and it's difficult regardless of whether you're in seat or online. Though, obviously, there are some things that might make it easier when you're in person. Still, those cues are often misrepresented on the part of students. So, if you want for professors to do a better job teaching in a given classroom that maybe they're not doing a very good job, you have to give them the kinds of back-channel responses that will allow them to know whether you're understanding the material or not and where the miscommunications are happening. Yeah.